Dr. Eve Carter inhaled deeply as she stepped onto the cracked tarmac of the Mbandaka airstrip, the sweltering Congolese heat already clinging to her skin. The air was thick with moisture, carrying the scent of damp earth, distant wood smoke, and the ever-present hum of insects. She adjusted the straps of her backpack, feeling the weight of months of planning finally settle on her shoulders. This was it. The culmination of years of research, funding proposals, and logistical nightmares. She and her team were about to venture into one of the most unexplored regions of the planet, seeking out undiscovered plant and animal species hidden deep in the Congo basin. The rest of the research team disembarked behind her, stretching after the long flight. 11 of the world's top biologists, zoologists, and ecologists had been handpicked for this mission, representing leading institutions from the United States, Europe, and the United Kingdom. "Feels like stepping into a goddamn sauna," muttered Dr. Philip Mercer, wiping his brow. The British zoologist was in his late 50s, his graying beard already damp with sweat. "Welcome to the jungle, I suppose. You expected anything less?" Eve smirked. Mercer grunted, adjusting his pack. "I expected a cold beer and a proper bed. Instead, we've got weeks of swamps, mosquitoes, and Lord knows what else." "You signed up for this," Dr. Emily Novak teased, nudging him with her elbow. The American botanist was barely 5'4", but she carried herself with a confidence that made her presence known. "Besides, don't tell me you're not excited to document species no one's ever seen before." Mercer scoffed. "Excited? Sure, but I'd prefer it without the heat stroke and insects." A man approached from the side of the airstrip, his towering frame and confident gait immediately setting him apart from the other locals milling about. He wore a loose khaki shirt and cargo pants, a rifle slung over one shoulder, and his dark, weathered face was lined with experience. Henry Mboko, their guide. "You must be Dr. Carter," Henry said in a deep, steady voice, his English carrying a faint French accent. Eve nodded and extended her hand. "That's me, and you must be Henry." He shook her hand firmly, then scanned the rest of the team with sharp eyes. "I will take you to the village where you will prepare for your journey. The jungle is not forgiving to those who are not ready." A beat of silence followed. "Sounds ominous," Mercer muttered. Henry didn't smile. The ride to the village was long and bumpy, the convoy of rusted jeeps kicking up dust as they navigated the winding dirt roads. Eve watched out the window as the jungle stretched endlessly on either side, a seemingly impenetrable wall of green. The village was small, nestled near the banks of the Congo River. Wooden houses with thatched roofs stood on stilts, their exteriors weathered by time and rain. Children ran barefoot through the dusty streets, pausing only to stare wide-eyed at the Caucasian newcomers. As the team unloaded their gear, villagers began to gather, murmuring among themselves. There was an unease in the air, something unspoken but palpable. An elderly man, his face lined with age and wisdom, stepped forward. He spoke rapidly in Lingala, his voice carrying a warning. Henry listened intently before turning to the team. "He says, you must not go too deep into the jungle." Eve frowned. "Why?" Henry hesitated, then translated the old man's next words. "The J'ba Fofi." A slight worry ran down Eve's spine at the way the villagers reacted to the name. Some averted their eyes, others made gestures of protection. "What's that?" Mercer asked, raising an eyebrow. Henry's expression was unreadable. "A legend. Giant spiders. They say they hunt in the trees, burrow beneath the ground. They wait for those who stray too far." A brief silence followed. Then Novak chuckled. "Come on, you're kidding, right?" Henry didn't answer. Mercer scoffed. Even if a species of oversized spiders did exist, it would collapse under its own weight. The biology simply wouldn't support it. Henry remained impassive. "Believe what you wish." Eve crossed her arms. "Do you believe in them?" He met her gaze, his dark eyes unreadable. "I believe many have gone into the jungle and never returned." The unease in the air deepened. Eve exhaled. This was exactly the kind of superstition that came with remote expeditions. The jungle was dangerous, predators, disease, the elements. But giant spiders, they had science on their side. "We appreciate the warning," she said diplomatically. "But we've planned for everything. We'll be fine." Henry said nothing. That night, as the team prepared their gear for the expedition, Eve overheard Mercer and Novak joking about the man-eating spiders. She wanted to laugh with them, but she couldn't shake the look in Henry's eyes. Morning came with a heavy mist rolling in from the river. The team loaded their equipment into a long motorized canoe, their supplies carefully packed and waterproofed. 2 armed American mercenaries, Sergeant James Miller and Private Derek Shaw, boarded with them, their rifles slung casually across their backs. Some parts of the jungle were owned by vicious rebels, guerrilla war fighters who had no problem killing and torturing foreigners on their land. But even they didn't go deep into the parts that were too vast and unexplored. "Just in case," Miller had said with a wink. Henry took his place at the helm, gripping the tiller. "It is a long journey. Stay within the boat. Do not touch the water." The team exchanged glances, but followed orders. As the canoe pushed off from the shore, the village grew smaller, swallowed by the mist. The jungle loomed ahead. Hours passed. The only sounds were the steady thrum of the motor and the calls of unseen creatures echoing through the dense foliage. The further they traveled, the more untouched the world became. Lush, ancient, unknowable. Eve watched in awe as colorful birds flashed between the trees, their calls piercing the stillness. The water beneath them was dark and deep, reflecting the towering canopy above. Henry slowed the boat. "This is as far as I go," he said simply. Eve turned, frowning. "You're not coming with us?" Henry shook his head. "I will return at sundown. If you are not here, I will assume you are dead." Silence fell. "Dramatic," Mercer muttered. Eve studied Henry's face. He wasn't joking. When he saw no one laughing, he simply said, "Good luck." Without another word, he turned the boat around and disappeared into the mist. Eve inhaled sharply. The jungle waited. The team stepped onto the shore, adjusting their packs. The jungle was alive, buzzing with the sound of insects, the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting shifting patterns along the forest floor. "All right," Eve said, taking charge. "Stay together. Document everything. We meet back here by sundown." Excitement rippled through the team. Cameras clicked, sketchbooks were opened, samples were collected. It was a biologist's paradise. After a few hours of exploring and collecting samples, chaos began to unfold in the lost world. Eve heard it, something unnatural. A clicking hiss. Low, deep. Not a snake, not an insect, something else. Her pulse quickened. The jungle paused. A scream. Dr. Emily Novak was gone. 1 second, she had been examining a rare flower. The next, vanished. The ground where she had stood was a gaping hole. The team rushed to the edge. Something moved inside. A pair of legs, long, spindly, covered in coarse brown and purple hairs, unfurled from the darkness. Eve's breath caught. The legend was real. The J'ba Fofi existed, and they were hunting. The creature dragged Novak beneath the earth. One moment, she had been kneeling by a flower, marveling at its unique structure, and the next, she was gone. The ground had opened up, dragging her down into the darkness with a shriek that ended in a sickening crunch. Novak, Eve's voice tore through the silence, her heart hammering. The team stood towards the gaping hole, flashlights flicking on, their beams barely piercing the blackness below. The edges of the pit were slick, with freshly disturbed earth, the ground shifting slightly as if breathing. Something moved, again. A hissing, clicking sound slithered up from the hole, deep and unnatural. Then came a rustling, a mass of something shifting against the earth. The legs emerged. They were impossibly long, around 5 feet, covered in coarse brown and dark purple hairs, with joints that bent in ways that made Eve's stomach twist. A second leg followed, then a third. The J'ba Fofi pulled itself into the light. It was massive. Its body was the size of a large German shepherd dog, its abdomen swollen, pulsing, streaked with sickly purple markings. Thick, multi-jointed legs stretched outward, each ending in a sharp, clawed tip that dug into the earth with ease. Its eyes, 8 gleaming, onyx-like orbs, locked onto the team. It was like time stopped and everything was in slow motion. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The 2 mercenary soldiers with them were pretty much useless. They drew their weapons, but were in so much shock and fear they froze on the spot. The spider began to move toward them in a way it would make your skin crawl. One of the soldiers, Shaw, snapped out of it and began firing at the spider, missing it completely the first few bursts and hitting it in the abdomen before turning and running into the jungle. Miller panicked and followed. "Move!" Eve screamed. The team scattered as the giant spider lunged toward them, unfazed by the bullet that hit its abdomen, its massive fangs dripping with venom. It was fast, faster than something that large should have been. Dr. Philip Mercer wasn't fast enough. The spider leapt onto him, its front legs piercing his legs. Mercer let out a strangled cry, struggling to get the spider off of him. Mercer and the spider rolled around on the ground chaotically in the forest floor. His fingers clawed at the dirt as he tried to drag himself free, but the silk came next. A thick, white strand shot from the creature's spinnerets, wrapping around Mercer's legs in seconds. He let out a desperate yell, his hands scrabbling at the dirt as the webbing spread higher, binding his arms, his torso. Then the spider yanked. Mercer was gone, pulled into the jungle, his final scream swallowed by the thick undergrowth. Eve's mind was racing with fear in different directions. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But the hissing continued. She turned, her body trembling. The trees were moving. No, not the trees, the webs. They were everywhere. Strands of silk, thick as rope, stretched between the branches, nearly invisible in the dim light. And lurking within them, more giant spiders. Dozens. Their hairy bodies clung to the webs. Some hung motionless, their legs tucked close to their massive bodies, blending into the thick shadows. Others skittered along the strands, their black eyes locked onto their prey. The team was their prey. One of the mercenaries, Sergeant James Miller, lifted his rifle, his hands shaking. Then the trap sprung. 2 giant spiders dropped from the canopy above, landing squarely on Private Derek Shaw. The impact was instant. His rifle went off, firing wildly into the air as the massive arachnid's weight crushed him to the jungle floor. Shaw's scream cut through the trees as the spider's venomous fangs buried into his shoulder. His body seized, his limbs twitching violently, foaming at the mouth. His scream faded to a gargle. He went still, paralyzed. Eve watched, helpless, as the two spiders synergistically began wrapping him. Just like Mercer, just like Novak, the spiders didn't kill immediately. They preserved. Miller fired, his rifle spitting bullets. The first round missed, but the second hit its mark, tearing into the spider's thick exoskeleton. The spider screeched, its legs spasming as black blood splattered across Shaw's limp body. But there were too many. Another spider lunged from the trees, its fangs sinking into Miller's leg. He collapsed, screaming, as the venom worked its way through his system. Eve didn't wait. She turned and ran. Branches lashed at her arms, vines snagging at her pack as she tore through the jungle. The screams of her team faded behind her, drowned by the hissing chorus of the J'ba Fofi. She ran blindly, her breath ragged, her heart slamming against her chest. The jungle was a labyrinth of shadow and movement, the trees shifting as if they too were alive. She tripped. The ground vanished beneath her, and she plummeted forward, rolling down a steep incline. She hit the earth hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Pain exploded through her shoulder. She gasped, forcing herself upright, and what she saw made her freeze up. Webs stretched before her like a ghostly curtain, glistening in the dim light. Thick strands wove together, crisscrossing the trees, forming tunnels. This wasn't a random collection of webs. This was a nest, and she stumbled right into it. Out of all places, we chose to collect samples. We picked their fucking nest, she thought to herself. A chittering sound came from the darkness ahead, then another. She wasn't alone. A shadow moved within the webbing. Shapes, legs, eyes. She had seconds before they attacked. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her sheath knife on her belt. Then, something grabbed her ankle. She screamed as she was yanked backward, her body sliding across the ground. The world spun as she was dragged into the nest, her limbs flailing. She twisted, swinging wildly with her knife. The blade connected, slicing through a thick strand of silk. The force broke the web's hold, and she tumbled free, rolling to a stop in a small clearing. Panting, she pushed herself up. Silence. For a moment, the jungle held its breath. Then, a familiar voice. Low, urgent. Dr. Carter. She turned, heart hammering. Henry. He stood at the tree line, rifle raised. His face was grim. Eve staggered toward him, her legs barely supporting her weight. They're real, she whispered. Henry nodded. I know. He grabbed her arm. We need to go now. Behind them, the hissing began again. The giant spiders were close, and they were not finished hunting. Eve's legs trembled beneath her as she gripped Henry's arm, barely able to stand. Every breath burned in her lungs, and her body was slick with sweat and grime. The weight of everything, her team being eaten, the reality of the J'ba Fofi, the terror of nearly being cocooned alive, pressed down on her like an iron weight. Henry's face was hard, unreadable. We need to move, now. Behind them, the hissing returned. Eve turned sharply. The trees shifted, the webs trembled. They were coming. Run. Henry didn't wait for her to react. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her forward, forcing her legs to move even though they were exhausted. They plunged into the jungle, pushing through thick foliage. Branches clawed at Eve's skin. Vines snared her boots, but she didn't dare slow down. Somewhere behind them, the skittering of massive legs on bark and jungle floor was growing louder. Closer. Henry ducked beneath a fallen tree, dragging Eve with him. She hit the ground hard, mud splattering up her arms, but before she could react, Henry shoved a hand over her mouth. He pressed his finger to his lips. "Don't move." Eve's breathing was ragged, her chest heaving, but she froze. Through the foliage, the shadows shifted. A massive spider crawled into view, its grotesque legs flexing, its purple-marked abdomen glistening with moisture. It moved slowly, deliberately. Its eyes, 8 glossy, unblinking orbs, scanned the undergrowth. They both held their breathing in as much as humanly possible. The spider took another step forward, its legs whispering over the jungle floor. A rustling to the left. The spider turned sharply, its entire body coiling like a predator about to strike. Henry acted instantly. He grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it in the opposite direction. The sound cracked through the trees, and the spider spun toward it. For a split second, it hesitated. Then it lunged into the undergrowth, vanishing into the darkness. Henry didn't wait. He grabbed Eve's hand and yanked her forward. "Go!" They broke into a sprint, the jungle blurring past them. The ground beneath their boots sloped downward. Eve nearly lost her footing as they descended into a ravine, her hands grasping at vines for balance. The air was damp, thick with the smell of moss and rotting vegetation. The deeper they went, the more the trees loomed overhead, twisting together into a suffocating canopy. Henry slowed, gripping a low-hanging branch to steady himself. Eve collapsed against a moss-covered boulder, gasping for air. Where are we going?" Henry didn't look at her. His eyes were scanning the jungle, his grip tightening on his rifle. "There's an old poacher's camp near the river. My boat is waiting by the shore, just ahead of it. If we make it there, we might have supplies, maybe even a radio. The place is abandoned." Eve's stomach twisted. "And if we don't?" Henry finally turned to her. His expression told her everything. If they didn't find that camp, they were already dead. Henry nodded, adjusting his rifle. "Stay close." They started forward again, this time at a careful, deliberate pace. The jungle was quieter here, too quiet. The usual buzz of insects and distant calls of birds were absent. The silence was unnatural, a warning. The giant spiders were near. Eve's grip tightened on her knife. She could feel eyes on her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew better. They had to move smart, not fast. A single misstep, a single snapped twig, and they'd end up like Mercer and Shaw, paralyzed, wrapped, and eaten alive, their insides slowly turned into jelly and devoured. After what felt like an eternity of navigating the dense jungle, Henry finally held up a hand. Eve halted, her pulse hammering. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, was a small clearing, and at its center, a structure, a rusted metal shack, half consumed by the jungle, its walls dented and covered in moss. Nearby, a few abandoned supply crates were scattered, their contents long since ransacked. Henry exhaled. "We made it." They moved cautiously, stepping into the clearing. The place was eerily still, untouched for years, but it had once been used long ago. Eve pushed open the rusted shack door. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of mold and decay. Old maps, torn and faded, covered a small wooden table. A rusted hunting rifle leaned against the far wall, its barrel clogged with dirt. Her eyes locked onto something, a radio. A massive weight lifted from her chest. "Henry!" He turned sharply as she lunged toward the device, her fingers fumbling over the dials. It was old, battered, but it was worth a shot. "Please work." She twisted the knobs, adjusting the frequency. A crackle, then silence. Her hands shook. No, no, no. Another crackle. Then, a faint, garbled voice. Eve's breath hitched. She twisted the dial again, trying to make out the words. The signal flickered. Then, a clicking noise came from outside. Her hairs stood up on the back of her neck. Henry froze. A long, drawn-out hiss echoed through the clearing, then another and another. Eve turned slowly toward the shack's open doorway. Shadows moved beyond the tree line. Eyes, dozens of them, gleamed in the darkness. The Fofi had found them. This time, there was nowhere to run. The clicking sounds grew louder. Eve's pulse hammered as she and Henry stared through the rusted shack's doorway. The shadows moved beyond the tree line, shifting and coiling, legs twitching in the dim light. The giant spiders had surrounded them. They were trapped. Henry's grip on his rifle tightened. He moved slowly toward the window, keeping his breath steady. "We're outnumbered," he muttered. "We need to get to my boat." "How? They're everywhere," Eve said. Henry's jaw clenched. "We make them think we're still inside." Eve didn't like the sound of that. "And how the hell do we do that?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the shack, searching for anything they could use. His eyes landed on an old lantern sitting on a wooden crate. His gaze flickered to Eve. "We set a fire." "That's insane," Eve said, her eyes darting back and forth between the windows and entrance door. Henry didn't waver. "It's our only chance. I don't have enough bullets to kill them all." Outside, the hissing and clicking intensified. They could hear giant spider legs on top of the shack, skittering around like an infestation. It seemed like they were growing impatient, hungry. Henry grabbed the lantern, twisting off the cap. A strong chemical smell filled the air. Kerosene. He glanced at Eve. "Help me find something to burn." Eve's hands shook as she searched the shack. There were old papers, dried leaves scattered across the floor, a rotting cot in the corner. She grabbed all the old papers and fistfuls of dried leaves. Henry and Eve stacked the materials near the doorway, dousing them with the kerosene. The skittering sound of legs on metal. The sound of dozens of spiders climbing the exterior walls of the shack. "We have to go," she hissed. Henry grabbed his lighter. "On my signal, run for the trees." Eve's hands clenched into fists. Henry flicked the lighter. A small flame flickered to life. Then he dropped it. The fire exploded, flames roaring up toward the ceiling. The effect was immediate. A piercing screech erupted from outside. The spiders scattered, their sensitive eyes blinded by the sudden burst of light. Some darted back into the jungle, while others skittered sideways, their long legs twitching wildly. Henry grabbed Eve's arm. "Run!" They burst out of the shack, sprinting for the tree line. The flames behind them cast flickering shadows, turning the jungle into a chaotic blur of light and darkness. The spiders recovered fast. A spider lunged from the side, its legs lashing out. Eve ducked just in time, feeling the wind from the massive limb as it narrowly missed her skull. Henry fired his rifle. The bullet tore through the spider's abdomen. Thick black blood sprayed across the leaves, the spider shrieking in rage. They kept running. The river. She could hear it now, the rushing water just beyond the next ridge. They were close, so close. But as Henry was running as fast as he could, he tripped over a broken-down branch with the spider's sticky webbing attached to it. Eve skidded to a stop, heart hammering. Henry groaned, his foot snared in webbing. His rifle had fallen from his hands, just out of reach. The clicking sounds grew closer. Eve dropped to her knees, grabbing his arms. "Come on, get up." He struggled, but the webbing held tight. As she went to reach for her knife, a shadow loomed above them. Eve looked up and saw death. A spider towered over them, its massive form silhouetted against the dimming sky. Its fangs dripped with venom, its 8 black eyes locked onto Eve and Henry. Henry reached for his knife, desperately sawing at the webbing around his ankle. Go, go. Eve's mind screamed in protest. She couldn't leave him, but she also couldn't save him. The spider struck. Fangs sank into Henry's chest. His scream was raw, filled with pain and doom. His body jerked violently, the venom paralyzing him instantly. White and thick black substance coming from his mouth and nostrils. No, Evelyn choked, reaching for him, but the spider pulled him back. Henry's eyes met hers. For a moment, he fought. Then, he was gone, dragged into the darkness. She was alone. A loud hiss behind her snapped her back to reality. Another spider charged. Eve turned and ran. Tears blurred her vision, her chest heaving, her mind screaming at her to keep moving. The river, she saw it. Henry's boat was still there, bobbing in the current. Eve's muscles screamed as she forced herself toward it. Behind her, about 20 giant spiders closed in. The skittering of legs on earth, the hissing of mandibles clicking together. She wasn't going to make it. Faster, faster, she thought to herself. She jumped. The boat rocked as she crashed onto it, her fingers clawing at the wooden edge. One of the spiders lunged. Its fangs snapped shut, inches from her ankle. Eve kicked out, sending it tumbling back into the water. She scrambled to the motor, hands shaking. Come on, come on. She yanked the cord, and the engine roared to life. The spiders shrank back to the shoreline, hissing furiously at the noise. Eve didn't look back. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the dark river. She collapsed against the seat, her body exhausted from the adrenaline dump. The jungle blurred behind her. The hissing faded. She had escaped. She barely registered reaching the village. The moment the boat hit the shore, hands were grabbing her, voices speaking in urgent Lingala. She was carried from the boat, her vision spinning. Then, a familiar voice. Dr. Carter. She turned her head. An old man, the same elder who had warned her, was kneeling beside her. His expression was not surprised, not even saddened, only knowing. He spoke softly in Lingala, and one of the younger villagers translated. You have seen them. Eve could barely speak. They're real. The old man nodded. We told you not to go. Tears burned in her eyes. I didn't listen, she whispered. A long silence. The old man placed a hand on her shoulder. You lived. Eve flinched. The word felt wrong, like a curse rather than a blessing, because she had lived, and now she would never forget. No one would, because she would make sure the world knew the J'ba Fofi were real. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more horror content. If you have any real cryptid encounters, or you're a horror writer wanting to share your stories, please feel free to email me in the description anytime.